It was a pretty interesting evening. Thank you for agreeing to do this interview. The young reporter was pretty keen to get my attention, as you're retiring as CEO of one of the region's largest employers. Our newspaper wants to feature you in an article in Sunday's edition. I'm just a little worried that your readers won't have anything to be interested in. I replied that we're successful because we produce a superior product at a competitive price. I really don't think this is a corporate secret. This is what companies do. What I was looking for was human interest. The guy replied, I want to know things like how long it took you to get to the top of the company. Were you ever discouraged? How long have you been with Norris Enterprises? Have you started at the bottom and worked your way up through the ranks? Was there some turning point in your career that you can point to as the day you realized you were going to be the leader of the company? Or did it happen gradually? You seem serious, but I don't think you're old enough to remember the business climate in 2009. It was a very difficult period. You may have read about it in some history books. You may think that 10 years ago dinosaurs walked the planet. I remember the day I realized I was destined to succeed in this company as if it were yesterday. It wasn't 10 years ago. The story will be different from what you expect, so just sit back and I'll try to tell it. I'd like you to reconstruct the events as I remember them. You have a few minutes, don't you? I was asked to reflect on that spring day so long ago. I was awakened by the ringing of my cell phone. By the time I found the spot where I had dropped my pants on the floor the night before, the ringing had stopped. A quick glance at the cell phone showed that I had missed 7 calls. I fell asleep after Jay Leno's monologue. The clock on the nightstand showed that it was now just a few minutes after 6. Something must have happened between midnight and 6 a.m. to get so many calls. At 00 in the morning, the last call was from my boss's home phone. I called back and got an answer. Hello, Frank, an excited Marge Larson said. I'm glad you called back. There's hell waiting for you here. You'd better get home as soon as possible. My husband, your wife, and your wife's brother-in-law are in the hospital. Marge, they're in the hospital, so they'll be fine. But you need to get back here and help me clean up all the mess that came through the proverbial fan. What do you mean? I demanded an answer. Why are there so many people in the hospital? Was it an accident or an explosion? What happened? I wish the reason was so mundane. Frank, I have to go to the hospital, then visit my lawyer and finally get to the plant and find out what the hell is going on. I wish I'd been paying more attention to business lately. Roberta knows what's going on. Marge, let her handle the business while you focus on more urgent matters, I suggested, while my mind tried to make sense of the information Marge had revealed to me, that yes, Roberta is in jail. I've got to go, Frank. Try to get back here as soon as you can. I need you here. Marge urged me to end the call. I left the motel and drove north on Route 81. I tried to call a few people to find out what was going on at home. My wife and sister-in-law didn't answer. My in-laws didn't answer the phone. My wife's parents said they didn't know anything except that my wife and their other son-in-law were in the hospital. Both of my kids lived in Washington, D.C., and didn't know any more than I did, if anything. I went back to my hometown almost 3 hours later with no more information about the situation. I got to the hospital at 9. I got to the hospital at midnight, and went straight to the front desk. I soon learned that my wife had suffered a broken nose and a concussion. She was now under observation, which I took to mean she was in a room somewhere. I was shown to her room and she said, Frank, this is all a huge mistake, darling. You have to believe me. Your face and the fact that you were unconscious for half an hour or so just fooled the medical staff. They mistakenly thought something was wrong with you. If it's a mistake, we can get a big settlement for negligence. Let's go home. No, Frank. It wasn't a mistake. I have a concussion and a broken nose. I'll have to have surgery when the swelling goes down. The mistake was what happened to Jeff. Jack said, and then slowly added, So that's what happened. I see. Well, Tessa, I have to tell you that you're in a bit of a pickle here. It seems that a mistake was made, as you put it, involving my boss and your sister's husband. I'm sure you can imagine the questions I'm going to have for him. Can you think of some of the things you're going to want to ask me? I'm still getting over a concussion, so I'm not going to be able to answer them all right away. I don't think it would be a good idea to say too much right now. I'll feel better soon, and then we can talk things over. I can see that all that time at the law firm is paying off. Tessa, you just rest. While you're resting, maybe you can come up with some story that will explain everything to my satisfaction and maybe show that you're the helpless victim of some conspiracy. I was too angry to stay in the same room with my wife. I'd already learned that she, my boss and her sister's husband, had been taken from my house by ambulance the previous evening. On top of that, my immediate boss at work, Roberta, had been arrested and taken to jail at the same time, also from my house. It gave me a sense of anxiety and worry that I couldn't shake off. Am I being paranoid for worrying about such trivial things? Then she tells me she's too weak to tell me what the hell was going on last night at my house. As I was walking out of the hospital into the lobby, I was stopped by a man in a suit. He handed me some kind of ID with a bunch of fine print that I couldn't read without my glasses, despite being a bit farsighted. I could easily tell this guy things were getting more interesting by the minute. Mr. Barker began his interrogation. Can I ask you a few questions? You have a little time, don't you? You can't take your wife home for a few more hours, can you? Almost any definition you just did would fit. I replied. I lied. Is that it, or is there more to it? After a long pause, he finally replied. I'm trying to piece together what happened last night at your house. There are several versions of events, but they all point to you being the central force in this perfect storm. Where were you last night? I was in Harrisburg. I met with a client and then had dinner with him. I'm staying at the Motel 8 near Hershey, and I left this morning just after 6 o'clock. I was sent there at 00 this morning on orders from my boss, Jack Lyson, through my immediate supervisor, Roberta Peters. You've already spoken to them, so you should have known that unless they were in a truthful mood. They both told me you were sent to Harrisburg. The detective admitted it's a little more complicated. Miss Peters said you called from Harrisburg and asked for a package to be delivered to your home last night. She was so sure you called her because she responded to your request. I said that was nonsense. I didn't call her, I didn't talk to her, and I didn't know she came to my house. I called my boss's house last night and spoke to her. I asked Mrs. Larson to let me talk to her husband, but she said he was out of town. He'd gone fishing in upstate New York and would be back late the next evening. Mrs. Larson asked me if this was important, since her family actually owns the business. I didn't see any reason to keep her in the dark, so I explained my dilemma. I'd bought an expensive pearl necklace. I'd left my wife's birthday present in my office, and I was worried about two things: that I'd left it there and that my wife wouldn't get it for her birthday, which was today. I told Marge that I was going to ask Jack, my boss, if he could drop the present off at my house. My wife was going to leave to visit her elderly grandmother in a nursing home in New Jersey. I was hoping the necklace would be at the house when I got back from my trip, so I could call her and ask her to try it on. She'd probably be really pleased with me, even if I had to be away on business on her birthday. I thought Miss Peters had basically told me the same thing, but she said you knew Mrs. Linson would call. She said her husband was away fishing and that you'd set her up. The detective said you'd set her up too. I called my boss to ask him to do me a personal favor. I had no idea Roberta would be involved. I still have no idea what happened. Why are you asking me these questions? Why is she under arrest? What happened in my house last night? Did you ask Jeff Rogers to go to your house to let Miss Peters in? The Flatfoot cop showed he has the temperament and brains of a bulldog. Where on earth do you get this idea from? I asked in bewilderment. I called my wife's sister June and told her she might get a call from my boss. That was before I talked to his wife. I found out he was out of town, so I asked her if she could drive over with the spare key to our house that she kept. I met my boss there and let him in. It was a pretty simple request. It looks like he thought I was a detective, which was pretty funny. I guess he must have seen me as more of a Charlie Chan character, which is a fictional police detective created by writer Earl D. Biggers for a series of detective novels. Day cop, why don't you fill me in on what's going on? How did my wife or any of these other people end up in the hospital? Why was Roberta arrested? Who was kicked off American Idol? That's a TV singing competition series. This week, I demanded to know everything. I can tell you right now that Lil Rounds is fried. The departing lawman was heading for the box of donuts the patrolman had just delivered, you idiot. I growled back at the detective. I thought she was going to win this whole case. I couldn't think of anything else to do, so I headed home. I was angry at my wife for using evasive language when I asked her what had happened. I didn't care for Jeff, my former brother-in-law. My sister-in-law and my boss, Jack, have been giving me a hard time ever since my sister-in-law got married. Law brought his sorry ass home from college about 15 years ago. He was a sophomore guard on a Penn State team that nearly lost in the Orange Bowl. Somehow that elevated him to hero status in that orphanage. My wife called her family home. The fact that he never finished university and couldn't get a steady job didn't matter. He was a great guy. My boss was another great guy. I demonstrated my knowledge of the business and my value to the company on numerous occasions. I didn't want to sound like I was bragging, but I knew more about Norris Enterprises than he and Roberta combined. The only downside to my employment record was that I was a man. So Jack, my boss, promoted Roberta to me. I think it was because she made love like a mink. I suppose it was an affirmative action since she never told him no. Now, Roberta was in jail and the other suspects were in the hospital. I was unable to find out the cause other than Tessa had a concussion and a broken nose, but I didn't know anything about the other two injuries. I didn't even know why Roberta had been arrested. It was ridiculous to think that they were blaming it on me. The house looked like it had been hit by a bomb. The front door was broken out and nailed shut with some crooked nails. I walked over to the door to the kitchen and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was a trail of blood coming down as I walked down the stairs. I noticed more blood on my leather couch. It was similar in consistency to liver and was a bright crimson color. I decided to ignore it and walked up the stairs, trying not to step on the blood trail. It became almost impossible when I entered my bedroom, with blood everywhere, on the floor and walls and furniture. Then I saw a wrapped box containing a pearl necklace. I picked up the wrapped box from the corner of the room by the closet and opened it. The necklace was intact and undamaged, so I slipped it into my pocket. I studied the scene of the massacre, but I couldn't make sense of it. I realized I should have watched more crime shows and less reality TV. I left the house as I found it and headed for the office. Tessa had been involved in the appearance of the blood, so she could have cleaned it up or arranged for it to be cleaned up. I had a bad feeling about the whole situation. There was less blood in the corral site of the most famous gunfight in the history of the American Old West than there was in my bedroom. Things like that rarely happened when I was sitting in bed reading a novel. Marge was in the office when I arrived. It was obvious that she was feeling anxious. I guess if the superior is hospitalized or imprisoned, it creates a certain amount of tension. Marge Larson called from her husband's office inviting me to join her. "I'm glad you're back so soon. Were you at the hospital?" I admitted as I entered the room and closed the door. My wife bullied me for a couple of minutes, and then some genius from the police department questioned me. "Did you tell him anything?" Marge asked. I was really feeling I was out of my depth. What kind of question was that? What on earth could I have told him? "Yes, Marge. I told him where to find Jimmy, a missing Union man, probably killed by the mob. Elvis Presley. There were suspicions he wasn't dead in Sasquatch. I didn't want to, but the guy turned out to be so smart and got it all out of me. What on earth can I tell him? If I have no idea what's going on," I protested vehemently. "How did you explain that your brother and you said the law was at your house and your wife's sister would let me in?" I told Roberta that, and she laughed. It was a great idea. Have you ever taken part in a conversation when you don't know what's going on? You think you understand what's being said, but it doesn't make sense when you put it all together. You wonder if you've got brain damage or are in a stupor. I felt the same way. "What the hell are you talking about, Marge?" I asked into the void. Marge stared at me for a few seconds. Then, after a few seconds, it seemed like he suddenly made a brilliant observation. Frank, you didn't know anything, did you? Marge asked rhetorically. You really wanted Tessa to get that present for her birthday, but you didn't know about Jeff. You had no idea that he was the one who let Roberta into your house. Marge, I'm sorry I don't know what's going on. I'm sure you'll fill me in, but I'd appreciate it if you could do so quickly. I don't have much time. I told the hospital I'd be back at 1:00. I'm picking up Tessa and bringing her home. Just lay it all out and tell me in plain English so I understand. Let's start by saying that you really don't want to take Tessa home. She has a broken nose and a concussion because Jeff punched her in the face. Marge said, Don't turn this into a game. Marge, I warned you. Can you guess that I want to know why he hit her and why I shouldn't take her? Jeff hit her in a fit of jealousy when he saw her riding my husband cowboy style. It was more than he could handle, so he hit her hard and then started hitting Jack. He did a hell of a job on Jack's balls, not to mention breaking his jaw and knocking out almost all of his teeth. Tessa was riding Jack, and Jeff got mad and jumped Jack for me. We were never that close, but I had him to thank for that. Wow, that's a lot to take in at once. Marge, Jack and Tessa were playing love games. Jeff caught them and whacked Jack for me. I owed that jerk a lot. I was ashamed of all the times I made fun of him. No, Frank, Marge said. You slept with your wife's best friend for years and went ballistic when he found out she was unfaithful to you. I was shocked. Jeff and Jack had both been with Tessa. How could I have missed that? It was obvious that if Marge was right, I wasn't going to be in a hurry to get Tessa out of the hospital. Why was Jeff himself hit and hospitalized? Let me see if I got this. Right, Marge, Jeff came to my house to tell Roberta about my gift for Tessa. They assumed that Tessa and Jack were out of town and the house would be empty. They somehow caught Tessa riding Jack. Did Jeff screw Tessa over because he thought she was his exclusive girlfriend? Then he worked Jack over for sleeping with her. Are we sure now? I asked. I think you've got it right. I think Jeff probably beat himself unconscious, even though it didn't take much. I tried to do my best Charlie Chan impression, but it wasn't very good. Marge actually grinned as she replied. Roberta stabbed Jeff in the femoral artery. He was bleeding like a hunted hog. The police arrived just as she shot him and ended up breaking down your front door by then. Jeff was dragging his ass down the stairs and was covered in blood all over your leather. I see you've got the couch covered in blood. Are you going to tell me that Tessa played with Roberta? That's so wrong. It wasn't Tessa. Marge explained that Roberta and Jack had been sleeping together for about a year. When she saw Jeff give her boss and lover such a thorough ass kicking, she pulled a gun out of her coat pocket and shot Jeff. She was arrested for multiple firearms violations and for shooting the ... It seems to me, Marge, that you're pretty ... You were pretty clued up about this whole thing, weren't you? I bet you were under the bed or even with Jeff at the same time. I wouldn't be surprised. Marge grinned. I had a detective following Jack around for the last few weeks. He was outside your house listening through a device he'd hidden in Jack's pants. He was the one who called the cops when he heard Jeff going crazy. If you had someone watching Jack, you'd know he was already at my house. Did you ever think that sleeping with Tessa when you sent Roberto to deliver the necklace might cause problems? Everyone knew Roberta had a gun. I practically yelled at Marge, or actually Frank, that I'd thought this Annie Oakley, the American sharpshooter who starred in Buffalo Bill's Wild West, might pull out her old pig's foot and do some frontier justice. Marge smiled. I just didn't expect your brother. And I didn't realize he was sleeping with Tessa too. I thought June would let Roberta in and be a reliable witness to what was going on. It's a good thing I thought of that, because if Marge hadn't let Roberta in, Tessa and Jack could have been shot. I noted excitedly. Did you ever think of that? Well, of course I did. I knew it was possible. I thought you'd think of it too. I knew everything and were trying to set me up to catch Jack and Tessa. I just set Roberta up to protect the innocent. The fact that Jeff, who let Roberta in, was also Tessa's lover and proceeded to beat the crap out of both of them was just the icing on the cake. I thought you planned that one somehow too. Now Jack and Roberta are out of business, and you have a company to run. Marge, hadn't you thought of that? Were you so out for revenge that you were willing to destroy the company your father built from scratch? I demanded an answer. Frank, I thought about it. We both know you're more oblivious than those two. I thought you might like Jack's position and his office with double the salary. You'll also get a first-class chick that Jack will never be allowed to service again, if you know what I mean. Marge, I almost blew it when I stupidly asked, do you mean Roberta or Tessa?